I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love. And I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them.
Shalom, shalom, folks. This is Brother Tindall from Something to Chew On coming in. I'm going to do a little video for you. For those who know, and for those who don't know, I did one the other day, and part one in this series called Misconceptions in Interpretations. And it all started with, I post the daily Torah portion on my page every day. Well, almost 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, it was Leviticus chapter 11 with the food laws, and I put up there, daily portion, like I always do, daily portion, the date, and then the address for where the scripture's coming from. And normally I would just put the text, but that day I said something. A personal commentary, if you will. But I basically pointed to two truths, two facts that a lot of people don't realize. The first one is Ephesians 2, how the two have been made one new man, meaning we are brought into the commonwealth of Israel. And then the second one is that we are grafted into the olive tree that is Israel, Romans 11. Okay? And like always, whenever, and at the very end of it, I said, so that means you are Israel, and therefore this passage applies to you. Basically, pointing to obedience. And as always, whenever you speak of obedience or Torah, or law, or the instructions of Yah, however you want to, whatever phraseology you use, but when you bring that concept up, you immediately know who's in their flesh, because they all come out of the woodwork and they want to argue with you. Law's done away with. We're under grace, not the law. It's nailed to the cross. All that was for the Jews. That's just all the excuses that we've all heard. Okay, well, the first little video I made, I spoke about two misconceptions, and it was from the same person. They said, I could tell just by the way they were commenting on the post that they did not have an understanding that there's a difference between covenant and law. They thought they were the same thing. So I spoke about that concept. And then the other thing they had said was they tried to equate the olive tree that we are grafted into, as Rav Shaw or Paul spoke of in Romans 11, to Messiah himself, as opposed to Israel. And I spoke on that. Now, for anybody who's seen the post or wants to, I'll put the link in the descriptions. You can go and look at it and look at all the context that you want and read all of it and see. Now, mind you, there's one post on there where, don't ask me why, but there's some foul language just out of the blue. So I apologize in advance for that. I'm not one to delete comments like that. They're teaching moments, so to speak. But anyway, but there were a lot of people that come out and, we're not under law, all these kind of things. And me, for those who don't know, on Facebook, I will, instead of typing out a long explanatory comment. Is that the right way to say it? And a long comment explaining, I'll just simply make a little 5, 10, 15-minute video, and I'll upload it as a comment or a reply. And it's easier to do that for me to just talk than to type all this stuff out. So there's a lot of them on there that I responded to like that. But this one, I wanted to do something about it, but I was like, let me stop and let me think so I can get all this out and get it in some way that it'll make sense to the Torah observant. It'll give them a tool to put in their belt, an apologetics tool. But for those who don't believe that we should obey the Torah, hopefully you're going to watch this through the whole thing, and you'll see, and I'll explain this to you. And once you hear the explanation, it'll make perfect sense. And whether you accept it or not, that's not up to me. But I'm going to read what the person wrote, and then I'll read the responses so you have the context, and then we're going to go from there, okay? I'm going to deal with the two concepts today. The person wrote this. He says, if you live by the law, you will die by the law. This is why Christ brought grace. And that's all he said. That was his comment, okay? And then my reply was seeking clarification. Before for those who know me, I normally ask for clarification before I start correcting someone to make sure that I'm understanding what position they're coming from. And that's what I did here. This is what I said. I said, you speak as if grace is only in the New Testament. Salvation has always been by grace. That was my reply. And he replied back, and he said, grace came at the cross, not before. Now, for anyone who believes that grace came at the cross and not before, pay very close attention, and we're going to correct that misconception in interpretation. That's a misconception people have, and it causes them, it acts as a filter, a filter when they sit down to read and interpret the text. Okay, and I say 90% people who believe that will go to one specific verse. And I'm going to bring up the verse, and then I'm going to show you something, and then I'm going to read something about it. Okay? So let me bring this up real fast. Hang on just a second. Okay. We're going to go to the Gospel of John, Yochanan, chapter 1 and verse 17. I've got it highlighted, so let's look. Okay. This is one of these verses where this concept that the law was in the Old Testament, but grace was in the New Testament. This is one of the verses that people always point to. Now let's read it. It says John 1:17. It says, this is from the King James. I'm gonna do most of all this today in the King James. Although But it says, for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Okay. People will read that and then interpret it like this person did. Grace came by Jesus, and there was no grace in the Old Testament. It did come before it came at Jesus at the cross. Isn't that how he had it? But if that's the true interpretation of this verse, what does this say? Truth. Wouldn't that mean that there was no truth in the Old Testament? A truth only came through Christ? So that right there should be an indication that thought that grace is only in the New Testament, only came through Christ in the New Testament, is false. Why? Because if that's the case, then truth also was not in the Old Testament and therefore only came through Christ on the cross in the New Testament. Now, see, that right there should be enough to key in your mind. Maybe the way I've been interpreting that verse is not right. But I'll take it a step further. Do you see this word but right here? Do you see how everything else in this verse is in black? And then that is in gray. And it's also in italics. What that means is that word but is not in the original Greek manuscript from where the King James was translated. For those who do not know this. Okay, if you pick up your King James Bible and you look, that word but is going to be in italics. That tells us that it is not in the original Greek manuscript. Okay? Here, let's go back up here. I'm going to transition back. But the fact that it's in italics means that it was added and it's not in the original manuscript. Okay? Now, with that said, let's do this. I'll say this. Grace was in the Old Testament. I don't see how anybody could say that grace was not in the Old Testament. I just don't get that. But it's a misconception a lot of people have. Let's go back to the window with the Bible study. And I'll show you. Okay. Just point out a few things. Okay. I'm going to bring up the search window. Pops up here. Now I want you to notice the King James. So that's the version we're going to be searching through. All right. Now I'm going to go over here. Old Testament. You see it says Old Testament? That's where it's going to search. Only in the Old Testament. Now I'm going to go over here, right here. And I've already did this earlier. So I'm going to, instead of typing it out, I'm going to just click on the little drop down window. I'm going to the first one that says grace. I'm going to bring it up there. So we're looking for the word grace in the King James, only in the Old Testament. And we're going to hit the search button. 37 verses found with 39 matches. That means there's 37 verses that have grace in it, and it's used more than once in some of those verses. Makes sense. The very first one, Genesis 6:8, which is the verse I used to show him. But Noah found grace in the eyes of Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. But there was no grace in the Old Testament. It came through Christ at the cross. It was only in the New Testament. Do you see the fallacy of that thought? I mean, but people have this idea, and that acts as a filter when they go to read and interpret their text. I mean, you can scroll down. You can scroll down. Every place it's used is highlighted. And I'm not going to sit here and read all these, but you see that it's there all through the Old Testament. Now, see here, it breaks it down for you. 11 times in Genesis, 5 times in Exodus. You see? All right. Now, we're going to do one more search. We're going to still look for the word grace in the King James, but this time we're going to look in this thing. When I search, it doesn't have the option of looking in only the Gospels. It's the Gospels plus the book of Acts. Okay? So, we're going to get the search results for that. But I just want you to look at this. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to change this again. I'm going to scroll down to where it says Gospel and Acts. That'd be Matthew through the book of Acts. And we're going to search. And let's just see how many times the word grace appears in the 4 Gospels. It's used 14 times. You see right down here in the bottom. 14 times. If you go up here, it's used once in Luke, John. It's used 4 times in the Gospels. And if you look at those verses, none of them are the words from the Master. Just let that sink in for a second. Okay? I mean, you can sit there and read all those verses if you want, but none of those are the words of Yeshua or Jesus. None of them are. Now, the rest of them, because it gives them to you in order, the rest of them, I'm going to scroll down so you can see the rest of them are all in the book of Acts. All right, we see that, how they're all in Acts. Right here, Luke, 1 time. John, 3 times. Acts, 10 times. Now, that ain't the rest of the New Testament. That's only the Gospels and Acts, like I said. But just let the fact that Jesus, Yeshua, in the King James, never used the word grace. Let that sink in for a second. Okay? Now, I'll take it back off, and I'm going to go back to this. Because I'm going to read something I wrote on this subject. Now remember, here, let's go back just one more time so you can see this. John 1:17. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Now remember, word but is in gray and in italics. Either way, gray or italics, means it's not in the original text. Like I've said, for those who use the King James, go pick your actual physical copy of the King James up and look this verse up, and you will see that that word but is in italics. And anywhere in your King James where a word is in italics, what it tells you is that it is not in the original manuscript. It was added by the translators. Okay, now with that in mind, we're going to go back, and now I'm going to read something that I wrote about this concept a while back. Okay. Now I'm gonna put my glasses on, and I may not be looking at the camera because I'm gonna look over here to be able to read this. Now remember, I wrote this a while back in reference to something else. So when I read this, it's not going to be worded as if I'm reading it to you, but you'll get the gist of it, okay? He says, something to chew on. It says, a brother recently asked me about John 1:17 and its interpretation in relation to Torah observance. Here is how I answered him. May this give someone a better understanding and be a blessing to them as well. And then I quote the verse. It says, John 1:17, King James. It says, for the law was given by Moses, but, and I put it in brackets, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. And this is what I wrote. I said, notice how the word but is in brackets in the verse above. I said, what that indicates is that the word but is not in the original Greek manuscript. When the verse is read with the word but in place, it seems to be putting law and grace at opposite ends of the spectrum, so as to be contrasting the two concepts. And sadly, this is how people who believe that the law was done away with see these two concepts in relation to each other. If one reads the verse without the word but in place, it gives a whole new meaning, which is in fact the truth. Sadly, now let's read it. without the but. For the law was given by Moses. Grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Now, I'll continue what I wrote. If one reads the verse without the word but in place, it gives a whole new meaning, which is in fact the truth. Sadly, the spirit of antinomianism, which means anti-law, crept into the church centuries ago and has affected the way the original manuscripts have been interpreted, or have been interpreted. See, the translators of the King James believed the law was done away with, and therefore they interpreted the text to reflect their belief, that the law is done away with. This is why I say no English translation is perfect, because things are lost in translation, as the old saying goes. When the verse is read without the word but, the two are not in contrast or opposition to each other, but simply are being compared to show how they are alike. The verse shows the law came to its fullness through Moses, and grace came to its fullness through Mashiach, or Messiah. What I mean by this is that the law has always been, since the beginning, but was finally given in full and written down by Moses. For example, Genesis 25:6 from the King James. Because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Right there, we see the word law. And this was in Genesis before Moses wrote it down in Exodus. So, the law has always been. It just came to its fullness when Moses wrote it down. Okay. Like I said, right here. The point is that there was law before Moses wrote them down. But when Moses wrote them down, the law was given in full. Makes sense? Now, the same could be said for grace. For example, and I quote Genesis 6:8 from the King James, Noah found grace in the eyes of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Grace did not come through Christ. Let me rephrase that. Let me read what I've written on the page. Grace did not only come through Christ, but has always been a means of salvation. Ephesians 2:8. But grace, just as the law came to its fullness through Moses, came to its fullness through Christ. See, when we read correctly and with proper understanding, John 1:17 is comparing the law and grace, showing how they are similar, how they both reached their fullness, as opposed to contrasting them, showing how they are different. I hope this makes sense and was helpful in some way. Okay. Now, we're going to go back. Let's go back and look at the verse one more time. And if you're not convinced yet that grace was in the Old Testament and that this verse, that one word has skewed people's interpretation of it, let's just, like I said, let's look. If you think that grace only came through Christ and in the New Testament, now where does that put truth? Let's look up one verse. This was here, let's just look this up. Psalm. Wait a minute. Back. Psalm 119, 142. This is the King James. Right here highlighted in red. Thy righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, and thy law is the truth. Now let's think of that for a second. Grace was in the Old Testament, just like truth was in the Old Testament. But they both reached their fullness in Christ. Does not Christ say in John 14:6, for I am the way, the life, and the truth? No man comes to the Father except by me. But don't we learn in John chapter 1 that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us? And Yeshua was the Word. What that is talking about is that he was the law embodied in flesh, a perfect embodiment of the law, which is truth, which is Yeshua. Do you see how they all connect? The law, the truth, reached its fullness in Christ. When the Word manifests in the flesh. Just think about that. Okay, now, with all that said, we're going to go back. Let me adjust. We're going to go back and we're going to look at what he said. The original comment said, those who live by the law will die by the law. And I thought about that, and this is where I'm going to go. I'm going to go here. Let's bring it up. Let me make sure I got it. Okay, we're going to bring this up, and we're going to go to Galatians chapter 5. In the King James. Let me bring this up. I'm going to read it so you can see it. All right. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. This is one of these places. Let's just read it and we'll talk for a second. It says, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if ye be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Verse 3. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to the whole law. Verse 4. Christ is become of no effect unto you, whosoever of you are justified by the law. Ye are fallen from grace. Okay. Now let's just talk for a second. The way most people will read this, and they will see, like verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free. Okay? And be not again entangled with the yoke of bondage. And they'll say, see, the law is bondage, and Christ has made us free from the law. And I believe that for years. And And then they go on like it. If you talk about, if you say something about circumcision, then they'll probably point out these other verses. But Paul, I write unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. And if you circumcised in Christ, probably, well, what about somebody like me who, before I come into salvation and Christ and all this, I was circumcised as a child. So does that mean Christ profit me nothing because I'm circumcised? Rhetorical question for right now. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he be a debtor to the whole law. And then this last one. It says, Christ has become no effect to you, whoever of you are justified by the law. Ye are fallen from grace. I don't know how many times I have heard when I speak of obeying the law, Torah observance, obedience, any of this, somebody say, you fallen from grace. You fallen from grace. And they really don't understand what they're saying. And I can identify with them. And you try to explain it to people, but most people, they don't want to hear it. They don't have any humility to sit and listen. And maybe I was wrong. Maybe what this brother's telling me is truth. And, I was taught wrong and I've learned wrong. All right. Now, we're going to go. We're gonna deal with all this all kind of at one time. But I'm gonna go to a couple places in the scripture. Let me see. Let's go to Matthew 23. Wait a minute. Let me give some background. This is what I want to explain. We're going to talk, and I'm going to give you some background. I'm going to show you some other verses and things like that. And then we're going to look at these verses in Galatians again and see what they really mean. Okay. For those who don't know, you'll hear people use the word Torah. It's translated in your King James and most other English translations as the word law. But it would probably be translated better as instructions, meaning the Torah of Yah, or Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. God Most High, for those who don't understand what I mean, Yah, short for his name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. But the Torah of Yah, the law of Yah, the law of God, the instructions of Yah, the instructions of God, however you want to label it, okay? There's that. That is the written Torah. Didn't we just discuss Moses wrote it down at Mount Sinai? That's the written Torah. Okay, the Pharisees had their own laws, their own stuff. And that's called the oral Torah. And this is in Judaism. And it comes, I ain't even going to get into the history of this. But it basically started in the Babylonian exile. And then when they come out, the sect of the Pharisees began. And you had the oral tradition. And they teach, Judaism teaches that you have to obey the written Torah, which is what's in the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and you also have to obey their oral Torah, or their oral traditions, their oral law, the laws of the rabbis, the laws of the sages, the laws of the Pharisees. That, okay. When Yeshua or Jesus came, this oral man-made stuff is what he preached against. That's why he had it out with the Pharisees so often. Terms like letter of the Pharisees, tradition of the elders, traditions of man. That's what he's referring to, is that oral law. Okay. He never spoke against the written law of his Father. That's what he came to teach. He came to draw men away from this oral draw them away from that and back to the written law. Okay, keep that in mind. You have two separate laws. Next, you've heard the term Judaizer. I've been called that quite often. But Judaizer, what it means is one who taught Judaism as opposed to Yeshua. As in, to be saved, you had to follow Judaism, which was oral, or let me go back, which was written Torah and oral Torah. You had to do them both. But when one wanted to convert to Judaism, they went through a long process of learning written Torah, oral Torah, and all this stuff. And then the step they took to signify that they had converted to Judaism was they were circumcised. Does that make sense? So, at the time when Yeshua came and he was preaching and all this, and in the letter of Galatians, Paul would go in and say, the good news, faith in Yeshua. And these people, the Judaizers, would come in behind him and say, no, you've got to convert to Judaism and follow all the written and oral law and be circumcised before you can be saved. And Paul was like, no, you don't have to do that to be saved. Catch that. You don't have to do all that to be saved. You don't have to be circumcised to be saved. You don't have to follow the oral Torah to be saved. Okay? Now, with all that in mind, keep that in mind. And now let's go look at a few verses, and I'm going to kind of point out to you what I'm talking about. If we go to, let's see, Matthew 23. Let me make sure I got pulled up over here. Matthew 23. Now let's pull it up on the screen so you can see this. Now you notice the words in red are the words of the Master Yeshua. And this is Matthew 23. This is what the set, like it says up here. This is a King James version. As you can see right here in the top corner, this is a King James version. This is what most people know as the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees. But let's just read the first couple of verses, and I'm going to point something out to you. All right? How about this? Let's do this. I'm going to bring this up in a parallel view so you can see this in 2 different versions. This over here is the King James, words in red just like it was. And this over here is the Scriptures 2009. I'll read from the King James. What it says, then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Now, what that means is in the synagogues on Sabbath, the scribes and the Pharisees, those who taught the law, would sit in the seat of authority. The seat of Moses is what it's called. And that's where they would read the Torah scroll, read from the written law of God that we're supposed to follow, and teach from it. Okay? All right. Then Jesus in verse 3 says, all therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. Meaning, when they're in the seat of Moses and they teach it from the written Torah, what they tell you to do, you observe it. You do it. Okay? The second half, verse 3. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. Verse 4. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and they lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. Let's go and read that in the other translation. Verse 2, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses. Therefore, whatever they say to you to guard or observe or obey, guard and do. But do not do according to their works. For they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders. See, what he's doing, what the master is pointing out, is he's saying, when the Pharisees sit up there in the seat of Moses in the synagogues and they read from the written law, Torah, instructions of Yah, that's what you're to obey. But then when he makes that comment, for they bind heavy burdens hard to bear, that is a reference to the oral law that they have made up. I'm sure you've heard pastors and whatever talk about how they wash their hands like surgeons and all this kind of stuff. And that goes back to what Mark 7 says. Your disciples don't wash their hands. They don't follow the traditions of the elders and wash their hands. They eat with dirty hands. That was one of these heavy burdens, this oral law, oral Torah that they had made up. Okay? Now see. Remember, heavy burdens hard to bear. Now, let's go over to Matthew 11. And let's again read the words of the Master. Where is it at? Yep, here it is. We all know this. Matthew 11, out of the King James. Like I said, over here's the King James, and over here's the Scriptures 2009. But right here, the King James, it says, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. What are they heavy laden with? Heavy burdens, hard to bear, that the Pharisees had made up, that he makes mention to in Matthew 23, that we just saw. Do you see what I'm saying? And what it is these people were trying to gain their salvation because they had been falsely taught by the Pharisees that they had to do the written and the oral Torah. They had to do them both. And Yeshua says, no. But let's read that again, and then we're going to take it, read the whole thing. It says, come to me, all ye that are labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me. For I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. So there is a yoke and there is a burden. What Galatians 5 say? Galatians 5. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. So if Yeshua, Jesus, is saying, take my yoke upon you, then there is a yoke. He says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What Paul is talking about here in Galatians 5 is not the yoke of bondage as in the written law. Messiah came, like I said, he came. Let's go back. Messiah came, remember, written Torah, law, we're supposed to obey. Oral Torah, oral law, that we do not have to obey. Messiah, Jesus, Yeshua, he came saying, you don't have to do this, but this, basically, draw away from this written unnecessary stuff that the Pharisees have made up and return back to the Torah. This is a heavy burden, hard to bear, but the Torah is the yoke that's easy. The yoke is light. The yoke is easy, and this burden is light. Do you see what I'm saying? That's the contrast. I'm going to throw this in there. The confusion comes in this. Oh, let's look back. Let's look back at these verses in Galatians again real quick. Remember, just keep in mind how I told you that they taught, the Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees taught Judaism, meaning you got to obey the written law, which is what we're supposed to obey, but you also got to obey the oral law, the stuff they made up. You learn all this stuff, then as your sign of conversion to Judaism, you're circumcised. Okay, now with that in mind, let's go back to Galatians. That's what this passage is talking about. See, the problem is this. Paul uses the word law. Sometimes he means the written law, which we're supposed to obey, and sometimes he means the oral law, the man-made added to stuff that we do not have to obey. But he uses the term law to refer to both of them. And therein lies where the confusion comes from. Because we today, as Western world Gentiles, do not understand the fact that there are two. So, when we read our Bibles and we see law, we automatically go, oh, well, that's the law of God. So, we see all these places where Paul seemingly speaks good about the law. That would be the oral or the Torah of Yah, the written law. And then we see places where it seems like he's contradicting himself and he's talking about the oral law, the oral Torah, the oral law, the oral instructions, the man-made stuff, the Talmud. That's what it's called today. But see, he uses the word law to mean both of them. Why? Because they're both laws. One's written and one's oral. But see, we today don't understand that. But with that understanding, let's go back and look at Galatians. That section right there, and it'll make a whole lot more sense. Stand fast therewith, therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. Liberty from what? From the heavy burdens hard to bear of the oral law. And be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. The yoke of bondage to the heavy burden is hard to bear of the oral law. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, meaning if you are trying to keep all that stuff and convert to Judaism in order to be saved, the sign of conversion was circumcision. Christ shall profit you nothing. Meaning, if you're doing that to be justified, then Christ is not, you can't be justified through Christ. All right? Verse 3, for I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to the whole law. What that means, Judaism teaches you got to keep the oral law or the written law and the oral law. Both. Every bit of it. That's what it's talking about. If you're circumcised, meaning you've converted to Judaism to gain your salvation, which is not salvation anyway. That's the other gospel that Paul speaks of in the very first chapter. Preaching another gospel, that's conversion to Judaism for salvation. That's what it's actually talking about. It's not obedience to the law. It's obedience to the written or the oral law. But if you've trying to convert to Judaism for salvation, then you got to keep everything, because that's the way they teach it. Pharisees say you got to keep the written and the oral. And the oral is impossible. It's a heavy burden, hard to bear. But the written law, my yoke is easy, and that burden is light. That's what the Master said. Verse 4, it says, Christ has become no effect unto you, whosoever of you are justified by the law. He's not talking about the written law. He's talking about the oral law. The traditions of man, the stuff the Pharisees had made up, what has come to be known today as the Talmud. Ye are fallen from grace. Meaning, if you put your faith in Yeshua, you receive grace. But if you put your faith in the justification by the Talmud, the oral works, and circumcision, which is slang for Judaism, then you've fallen from grace. Why? Because that faith in that will not give you anything. Your faith has to be in Messiah Yeshua. So if you're doing all this oral tradition stuff, yeah, you've fallen from the grace of Messiah, which is over here. It's not, Paul's not saying that if you obey the written law, which Messiah told us was the yoke is light, burden is easy, or yoke is easy and the burden is light. He told us that's what he's referring to. That in obeying that is where grace comes in. But if you're seeking justification from this over here, then you falling from grace. You ain't in this no more. Do you see how it kind of all makes sense? You see how it kind of all makes sense when you have the proper historical and cultural context. It stems from the fact that we don't today, as Western world Gentiles, we don't understand that there are two laws: the written Torah and the oral Torah, or the written law, the written instructions of Yah Most High, and then the man-made tradition of men, tradition of elders. It's the Talmud. It's all the stuff they made up and tried to add to, which this tells you do not add to or take away, but yet they add to it. Okay? All this is what you don't have to do. All right? That's what it means. It doesn't mean if you're trying to obey the written Torah that you've fallen from grace. And I'll prove that one too. We're going to go look up one more passage. Well, I'm going to bring it up over here. I'm going to talk for just a second. Not much longer. I'm almost done. I don't know how long I've been talking. But, we're going to go look up one more passage. I'm going to make sure I get it. Okay. This is kind of along the same lines. This all kind of falls into the same categories. You know, grace came through Christ at the cross. No, it didn't. You're falling from grace. All this kind of ties in together with grace. But I've had people say this. This man did not say this, and it wasn't nowhere in the post that stemmed this whole thing. But I have been said this to before. Someone said, you're obeying, therefore you're falling from grace. And I'm just like, Think about that for a second. And I asked the person this, and I do this quite often. People don't like this, and excuse me. I say this quite often to people, and they don't like it. It's because they're in their flesh. Romans 8, 6, 7, and 8 says the carnal mind or flesh is hostility or is hatred toward God because it cannot submit or subject itself to the law of God. The flesh cannot subject itself to the law of God. So anytime somebody starts coming at you in opposition to obeying the law, that's their flesh. Whether they realize it or not, that's their flesh. They can quote scripture all day out of context, mind you, but they are coming at it from their flesh. All right, with that said, I had a guy tell me that one day. He said, "Oh, you falling from grace," because I'm talking about obeying the law. And I asked him, I said, "Well, have you killed anybody today? Have you murdered anybody?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, you're obeying the law. I guess you fell from grace too." Have you raped anybody today? No. Well, I guess you obeying the law. And mind you, that ain't in the Ten Commandments. So I said, if you ain't raped nobody, I guess you obeying the law that ain't even in the Ten Commandments. So you obeying the Torah itself. I said, so I guess you falling from grace. You stole anything today? No. Well, you're obedient, so I guess you fell from grace too. But do you see how the fallacy of that idea? Because you obey what Yah says we should do, you fall for grace. But, like I say, this stuff's been taught in the churches, many churches. I ain't going to say all churches, but many churches for so long. It's been pounded and pounded and pounded. And it's the leaven of the Pharisees, false doctrines and false teachings that has permeated everything. It's permeated the pulpits. It's permeated the way our English Bibles are translated. It's permeated the study Bibles and the commentaries in them. And it's even permeated the seminary schools. But to show the ultimate fallacy in this idea, let's go to Deuteronomy 18, and I'll be done. This is Deuteronomy 18. This is not the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are part of the Torah, don't get me wrong. But this is part of the Torah, which is not the Ten Commandments. Okay? This is what it says. And I'm going to read out of the Scriptures version. You can follow along over here in the King James if you want, but I'm going to read it out of the Scriptures version. And let's just see what it says. It says, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, your Elohim, shall raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses speaking. Like me from your midst, from your brothers, listen to him. According to all you asked of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, your Elohim, in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, my Elohim, nor let me see the great fire any more, lest I die. And Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh said unto me, what they have spoken is good. Meaning back at Mount Sinai, when Yah Most High was talking to the people. No, Moses, you talk to them unless we die. You go up there and you talk to them and we'll do. That's what this is referring to. Okay, now let's go back down. Okay. Verse 18. I shall raise up this is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh speaking. I shall raise up for them a prophet like you, like Moses, out of the midst of their brothers. And I shall put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be, the man who does not listen to my words which he speaks in my name, I require of him. Okay, we've all heard the term a prophet likened unto Moses. That's where this comes from. This is one of the places in the Old Testament where it is pointing directly forward to becoming Messiah. Why? Because Messiah, Yeshua, is the prophet likened unto Moses. Okay? Now this passage refers ultimately, let's go back. Hang on. This passage ultimately points to Yeshua HaMashiach, or Jesus the Christ. But it points from the time of Moses to every prophet that was until Yeshua came. And what did the passage say? That you should listen to him. And it says, verse 19 says, and it shall be the man who does not listen to my words which he speaks in my name, I require it of him. That word listen right there is Shema, meaning to hear and to obey. So Yah is saying the man who does not hear and obey the words of Yeshua, Yah's going to require it of him. And that's an archaic way of saying you're going to be held accountable because you're supposed to hear him and obey him, but if you don't, you're going to be held accountable for not doing it. I'm going to require it of you. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm going to throw in a little tidbit right here. It said, verse 19 said, and it shall be the man who does not listen to my words which he speaks. So think about that. And then all them places in the New Testament when Yeshua said, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. Whose commands is he talking about? Well, you can look through the Gospels and you'll see that Yeshua over and over and over said, I speak not on my own authority, but I speak on the authority of the one who sent me. It's not my words I speak, it's the Father who sent me who I speak. See what I'm saying? But right there it says, Yah speaking. He says, my words which he speaks, referring to when Yeshua comes. So all those things that Yeshua said, whose words were they? His or Yah's? So back to, if you love me, keep my commandments. It's not Jesus' commandments. It's his Father's commandments. But that's not even where I was going with this passage. The whole thing right there, it tells us in the Torah itself to hear, obey. Basically, believe in Yeshua. There is a Torah command that we are to believe in Messiah. So all those people who say, oh, you're obeying the Torah, you've fallen from grace. Well, I guess because if you believe in Messiah, then you have fallen from grace. Do you see the logical fallacy in your argument? I mean, I've already, if you hadn't gotten it by now, that should tell you. The Torah itself tells us to believe in Messiah when he comes. To hear him and obey. But yet you, average Joe person, say that if I obey the Torah, then I've fallen from grace. do you see the, what's the word I'm looking for? Oxymoronicness, if that's a word, of your statement. Oh, you're obeying, so you're falling for grace. No, it goes back to, like I said, when I pointed out in Galatians, you seek to be justified by the law. That's not talking about the law of Yah. It's talking about the oral law, not the written law. So my suggestion, that's all I got for now. I know I've probably talked for a while, but I'm going to say this. When you read through Paul, understand that he uses the one word law, but he's referring to either the written law, which we're supposed to do, the Torah of Yah, or he's referring to the oral, man-made traditions of man stuff, Talmud law. He says law, and he's talking about one or the other two. He makes no distinction between the two. But at the time he wrote this, the people who read it would have understood this. But we today don't. So when you read Paul, and it sounds as if he's talking negatively about the law, 99% of the time he's talking about the oral law. But if you see the verses where he's speaking positively, talking about obeying the law, more than likely he's talking about the written law, the Torah of Yah. There is a distinction. That's why there's so much confusion in the writings of Paul. Peter said, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, 16, 17, he said, Paul's hard to understand, and many are going to twist his words and fall into the error of lawlessness. And it's because they have no historical or cultural context to read it, or simply because their flesh wants to twist the scripture because their flesh don't want to obey Yah. Their flesh don't want to obey the law. Why? Because Paul told us, carnal mind is hostile toward God. And it cannot submit to the law of God. The flesh is going to twist the scripture any way it can. That's why I tell people all the time, humble yourself, humble yourself, humble yourself. And learn. And understand. If you read something and you think, oh, well, that just means I don't have to obey the law. No, you're wrong. You've interpreted it wrong. Go back and do it again until you figure it out. Ask somebody. Seek in humility. Don't just, oh, you got to obey the law. Because your pastor, who honestly was taught at the seminary school, all this leaven. That's all it is leaven. You got to learn to wade through this leaven. I'll be able to read these scriptures for what it says. But I hope I'll leave it at that, folks. I'll leave it at that. Just remember, two laws. One's oral and one's written. So you got to learn which one Paul's talking about. And once you start to understand that, and you learn some of the history and the culture of the time that this stuff was written, it starts to make a lot more sense. But that's my encouragement, folks. I hope and pray that this helps somebody. Those that are Torah observant, maybe you got something out of it. And those who aren't Torah observant, I pray that you watch this all the way through. And you would take this and receive this and go test it. Go look up some of these things I'm talking about. And you'll find out that it's true. But with that, I'll say shalom and blessings, folks. And as always, don't just read this thing, but study it. Like and share our videos. Comment below, good or bad. Give us ideas for new videos. But above all, pray for us and subscribe to the channel. It'll be a little circle icon with a cow's face on the bottom right hand of the screen. And with that, I say shalom, and don't just read your Bibles, but study them.